Mike sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. His 7-year-old son, Danny, sat opposite him, enthusiastically chomping on cereal. His wife, Lauren, bustled about the kitchen, her back turned as she prepared coffee. Life had felt normal, at least to Mike. He was a construction manager, working long hours to provide for his family, while Lauren ran her own online boutique from home. They had been married for 10 years, and although the relationship had its ups and downs, Mike always believed in the foundation of trust they had built together. "Daddy, can we go to the park later?" Danny asked, his voice filled with excitement. "Sure, bud," Mike replied with a smile, ruffling Danny's hair. "What brought that up?" "Oh," Danny said between spoonfuls, "it's where Mommy goes sometimes. She told me it's her quiet place." Mike glanced at Lauren, who froze momentarily before continuing to pour coffee. Something about her pause felt off, but he shrugged it off. "When was the last time you went with Mommy?" Mike asked casually. Danny tilted his head as if trying to remember. "Last Friday. She met Uncle Ryan there." The kitchen seemed to fall into a vacuum. The sound of Lauren's mug clinking against the counter snapped Mike back to reality. His wife's expression was carefully neutral, but he noticed her hands tremble slightly as she reached for the milk. "Uncle Ryan?" Mike echoed, forcing a chuckle. "I didn't know he was back in town." "He's not," Lauren said quickly, her voice overly calm. Danny must be confused. Maybe it was someone who looked like Ryan. Danny furrowed his brow. "But you called him Ryan, Mommy." Silence engulfed the room, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator. Mike's gaze locked on Lauren, who finally turned to face him. Her smile seemed forced, her eyes darting between him and their son. "You know how kids are," she said lightly, brushing past him to place her mug on the table. "Always making up stories." Mike nodded slowly, though unease churned in his stomach. Danny's innocent comment had ignited a flicker of doubt, and Lauren's behavior wasn't helping extinguish it. "Finish your breakfast, Danny," she said briskly. "Mike, don't forget you have that work meeting at 10. Mike nodded again, though his mind was already racing. Who was Ryan? And why had Lauren acted so defensive? As Danny dashed off to grab his toys, Mike couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. He decided to let it slide for now, but something about the way Lauren avoided his eyes told him this wasn't over. Later that night, Mike lay in bed beside Lauren. She had fallen asleep quickly, or at least pretended to. He, however, stared at the ceiling, replaying Danny's words over and over in his mind. Uncle Ryan. He couldn't recall a Ryan in Lauren's circle. His wife had always been close to her college friends, but none of them had ever gone by that name. Was it an old friend? A client? The question loomed large, refusing to let him rest. In the darkness, Mike made a quiet vow to dig deeper. If there was nothing to find, he'd let it go. But if there was more to this story, he needed to know the truth. The next morning, Mike decided to shake off the fog of doubt, at least for now. He got up early, made breakfast for the family, and kissed Lauren goodbye as she headed out for her usual gym session. Yet, as he watched her pull out of the driveway, he couldn't help but notice her unusually hurried demeanor. Once Danny was absorbed in a cartoon marathon, Mike went into the study. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. If he was going to find answers, he needed to start somewhere. He began with a simple search, Uncle Ryan. It was a ridiculous shot in the dark, but it felt oddly satisfying to take action. Unsurprisingly, the results were a dead end. Switching gears, Mike logged into Lauren's boutique website, scanning for anything unusual, like a recent hire or mention of the name. Again, nothing. Frustrated, Mike drummed his fingers on the desk. Was he overthinking things? Maybe Danny had misheard, or maybe it really was a casual acquaintance. But the tension in Lauren's face the previous day told a different story. That evening, while Lauren prepared dinner, Mike took Danny aside in the living room. "Hey, buddy," he said, kneeling to meet his son's gaze. "Can we talk about what you said yesterday?" Danny blinked up at him. "What about, Daddy?" "You mentioned Mommy met Uncle Ryan at the park. Are you sure that's what she called him?" Danny nodded. "Uh-huh," she said. "Ryan, I'm so glad you're here." Then they talked for a long time, so I went to play. Mike's throat tightened. What were they talking about? Danny thought for a moment, then shrugged. Grown-up stuff. Boring stuff. But he gave her a present. A present? Mike's voice caught. What kind of present? Danny's face lit up. A necklace. It was shiny and had a heart on it. Mike felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Lauren never wore jewelry aside from her wedding ring and a modest pair of earrings. Where was this necklace? And why hadn't she mentioned it? Thanks for telling me, Bud, Mike said, trying to keep his voice steady. Now, why don't you go wash up for dinner? Danny skipped off, leaving Mike standing there with a storm of emotions brewing inside him. Later that night, after Lauren had fallen asleep, Mike searched her jewelry box. His heart raced as he rummaged through the neatly organized compartments, but he found no heart-shaped necklace. Maybe she was keeping it somewhere else, or maybe he didn't want to finish the thought. He returned to bed, lying stiffly beside his wife. Each passing moment deepened his conviction that something wasn't right. But how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? The following day, Mike decided to act. He left work early, excusing himself from a team meeting, and drove to the park. It was a long shot, but if Lauren had been meeting someone here, maybe he could pick up on something. The park was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the walking trails. Mike strolled around, scanning the area. As he approached a bench near the duck pond, his heart skipped a beat. There, tucked beneath the bench, was a small, folded piece of paper. Mike glanced around to make sure no one was watching before bending down to pick it up. The paper was crumpled and weathered as if it had been there for a few days. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten note. Lauren. Friday, 3 p.m. Same spot. Can't wait to see you. Ah. Mike's hand trembled as he read and reread the message. The park. The exact location Danny had described. And the initials, R. Ryan. His stomach churned. What was his wife hiding, and why was she meeting this man in secret? Mike shoved the note into his pocket and left the park, his mind racing. When he arrived home, Lauren greeted him with her usual warm smile, but Mike couldn't return it. The secret she was hiding was no longer a question. It was real, tangible, and written in her own handwriting. Mike barely slept that night. The note in his pocket felt like a burning ember, too dangerous to hold but impossible to let go. He kept replaying Lauren's recent behaviors in his mind, the distracted looks, her occasional vague answers about her day, and now this. When morning came, Lauren seemed oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. She hummed softly as she packed Danny's lunch for school, her usual routine unbroken. Mike couldn't bring himself to confront her, not yet. He needed to be certain. He needed more proof. That afternoon, after dropping Danny off at school, Mike returned to the park. It was Thursday. The note had specified Friday at 3 p.m., and Mike was determined to see for himself who Ryan was and what was happening. He scoped out the area, noting the bench where he'd found the note, and a few strategic spots where he could stay hidden without being obvious. His stomach churned as he imagined catching Lauren in the act of, what? Was it an affair? A secret business deal? Something else entirely? Each scenario felt worse than the last, but the nagging uncertainty drove him forward. The next day, Friday, Mike told his boss he needed the afternoon off for a personal matter. He parked his car 2 blocks away from the park and arrived at 2:45 p.m., positioning himself behind a cluster of bushes near the duck pond. He had a clear view of the bench from there. The minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly. At exactly 3 p.m., Lauren appeared. She looked around nervously before sitting down on the bench, smoothing her skirt. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, a small, fleeting smile crossing her face. Mike's heart raced as he waited for the mysterious Ryan to show up. Every step on the nearby trail felt like a possible revelation. A man finally emerged from the far side of the park. Mike squinted, trying to get a good look. He was tall, with sandy blonde hair and dressed casually in jeans and a jacket. Mike couldn't recognize him from this distance, but the way Lauren's face lit up as he approached sent a dagger of pain through his chest. They greeted each other warmly, and though Mike couldn't hear their words, their body language spoke volumes. Ryan leaned in closer, his hand brushing Lauren's arm as he spoke. She laughed lightly, a sound Mike hadn't heard in months. Lauren reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. She handed it to Ryan, who opened it and pulled out a sleek watch. Mike's jaw tightened as he watched the man thank her with a broad smile, leaning in to hug her briefly. A million questions swirled in Mike's mind, but he stayed rooted in place, torn between confronting them and continuing to gather information. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few pictures before retreating quietly. Whatever this was, he wasn't going to let it continue unchecked. That evening, Mike couldn't hide his turmoil. He barely touched his dinner and gave vague, curt answers to Lauren's questions. She noticed his demeanor but didn't press, which only added to Mike's suspicion. If she wasn't curious about his mood, was it because she already knew why he was upset? "Are you okay?" she finally asked as they cleaned up the dishes. Mike forced a smile. "Just a rough day at work." She nodded, but he caught the faint flicker of relief in her expression. It was like she was glad he didn't press the topic further. That night, as she lay asleep, Mike opened her phone. He had never done this before, but the stakes felt too high to worry about crossing boundaries. He navigated to her messages and searched for the name Ryan. Nothing. Not a single text, no call logs, no emails. It was as if the man didn't exist. Mike frowned. Either she was incredibly cautious, or Ryan wasn't even using his real name. His resolve hardened. Whatever this was, he needed answers, and he was running out of patience. The next morning, Mike decided to test the waters. As Lauren helped Danny with his breakfast, Mike casually brought up the topic of old friends. "Hey, have you ever heard from anyone back from your college days?" he asked. Lauren didn't look up from pouring cereal. "Not really." "Why?" "I just wondered. You had that one friend, what was his name?" "Ryan." Her hand froze briefly, just enough for Mike to notice. She recovered quickly, smiling as she shrugged. "I don't think I know a Ryan." It was a bold-faced lie, and Mike knew it. Any remaining trust he'd clung to shattered in that moment. Whatever Lauren was hiding, she was determined to keep it buried. Mike's next move was clear. He needed to confront Ryan. But first, he had to figure out exactly who this man was. Over the weekend, he began piecing together clues from the pictures he'd taken at the park, focusing on identifying the watch and Ryan's appearance. Every lead he uncovered would bring him one step closer to uncovering the truth. Over the weekend, Mike's obsession with uncovering the truth reached a fever pitch. Each time he saw Lauren smile or laugh, it felt like an act, a facade concealing a secret she had no intention of sharing. He pored over the pictures he had taken at the park, zooming in on Ryan's features and the sleek watch Lauren had gifted him. The watch stood out. It was a luxury brand, expensive enough that Mike was certain it wasn't a casual purchase. Lauren's boutique was doing well, but a gift like that didn't fit their usual spending habits. Mike searched online, finding a near match for the watch. His suspicions deepened when he saw the price tag, over $2,000. Why was Lauren spending so much money on a man she claimed not to know? Monday morning, Mike decided to dig deeper into Lauren's finances. He logged into their joint account, where they managed most household expenses, but nothing unusual appeared. If she had purchased the watch, she hadn't used this account to do it. That left her boutique's business account. Lauren handled that separately, but Mike remembered she kept a record book in her office. With Lauren out running errands and Danny at school, Mike took his chance. He opened the desk drawer where she usually kept her planner. Sure enough, the small, leather-bound book was tucked inside. He flipped through the pages, scanning for transactions that might stand out. And then he found it. A neatly written entry from 2 weeks ago caught his eye. Client consultation, $2,500, gift for Ryan. Mike's heart pounded. Client consultation? Was that her cover? And why use such a specific description if she had nothing to hide? The discovery left him reeling. There was no denying that Lauren had spent a significant amount of money on Ryan, and she had deliberately kept it from him. The trust that had once formed the foundation of their marriage was rapidly crumbling. That evening, Mike confronted her indirectly. As they sat on the couch, Lauren scrolling through her phone, he said casually, "Hey, do you ever get those spam emails about weird charges on your accounts?" Lauren glanced up briefly. "Not really." "Why?" "Oh, I just saw this thing online about people buying expensive stuff and not telling their partners." "Crazy, right?" She laughed lightly. "Yeah, crazy. Good thing we don't have that problem." Mike nodded, forcing a smile. But inside, his anger simmered. Her lie was seamless, almost effortless. He couldn't decide what hurt more, the betrayal or how easily she denied it. The next day, Mike decided it was time to find Ryan. He took one of the photos he had snapped at the park and uploaded it to an online reverse image search. To his surprise, the results led him to a LinkedIn profile. Ryan Mitchell, marketing consultant. The profile picture matched the man from the park perfectly. According to his profile, Ryan lived in the same city and frequently worked with small businesses to help them grow their brand presence. Mike's hands tightened into fists. Was this how Lauren had met him? Had she hired him to work on her boutique, only for their relationship to take a personal turn? Scrolling further, Mike noticed that Ryan had listed several speaking engagements at local business networking events. One of them was happening in 2 days, just across town. When the day of the event arrived, Mike parked outside the venue and waited. He hadn't told Lauren where he was going, making an excuse about needing to work late. As he watched people file into the building, his pulse quickened. What if Ryan recognized him? What would Mike say? What would he do? Finally, Ryan appeared. He looked just as he had in the park, confident, polished, and completely unaware of Mike's presence. Mike followed him inside, keeping a safe distance. He listened to Ryan's presentation, his jaw tightening as the man spoke with charisma and ease. To anyone else, Ryan was just a professional giving advice on marketing strategies. But to Mike, he was the man who had shattered his marriage. When the event ended, Mike waited until Ryan was alone before approaching him. "Ryan Mitchell?" he asked, his voice low. Ryan looked up, surprised. "Yeah, that's me. Can I help you?" Mike forced a smile, though his fists clenched at his sides. "I think you already have. You see, I'm Lauren's husband." Ryan's confident demeanor faltered. For a brief moment, guilt flickered across his face. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ryan said quickly, taking a step back. "I think you've got the wrong idea." "Do I?" Mike pulled out his phone, displaying the pictures from the park. "Because this looks pretty clear to me." Ryan's face turned pale, and he opened his mouth to speak, but Mike cut him off. I want answers, and I want them now. Who are you, and what are you doing with my wife? Ryan hesitated, his gaze flicking to the pictures on Mike's phone. The confident mask he had worn during his presentation slipped, replaced by a flicker of panic. Look, it's not what you think, Ryan said, holding up his hands as if to ward off an attack. Lauren and I, it's complicated. Complicated? Mike's voice was low and controlled, though the fury brewing beneath the surface was anything but. You'd better start explaining. Now. Ryan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't mean to get involved in this, okay? She reached out to me a few months ago, said she needed help with her business. We met a couple of times to talk strategy, and things got personal. Mike's stomach churned. The confirmation of his worst fear hit him like a punch to the gut. How personal? He demanded. Ryan glanced around, lowering his voice. We never crossed the line, I swear. There were feelings, sure, but she said she wasn't happy and... Stop, Mike snapped, his voice shaking. You're telling me my wife isn't happy, so she confided in you? Bought you expensive gifts? Met you behind my back? Ryan looked as if he wanted to shrink into the floor. I didn't ask for any of that. I told her it wasn't right. I told her she needed to figure out her marriage before. Mike didn't let him finish. He turned and walked away, leaving Ryan standing there, his words ringing hollow in Mike's ears. When Mike arrived home, Lauren was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open. She glanced up, offering him a smile. You're home late. Mike dropped his keys on the counter and stared at her, his mind racing. He had enough proof to confront her, Ryan's admission, the note, the photos, the financial record of the gift. But part of him still hoped she would tell the truth on her own. How was your day? He asked, his voice flat. Lauren blinked, clearly taken aback by his tone. Fine. Busy with orders. Are you okay? Mike sat down across from her, leaning forward. I ran into someone interesting today. She frowned. Oh? Who? Ryan Mitchell, he said, watching her reaction closely. Lauren froze. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she quickly masked her expression. I don't know who that is. Mike laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You really expect me to believe that? After everything? I don't know what you're talking about, she insisted, her voice rising slightly. Don't lie to me, Lauren. Mike's voice cracked with anger. I know about the park, the watch, the money you spent. I know you've been meeting him behind my back. Lauren's face drained of color. It's not what you think. Then what is it? Mike interrupted. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around with another man while I'm out working to support this family. Tears filled her eyes, but Mike wasn't sure if they were from guilt or fear of being caught. I never cheated on you, she said quietly. I swear, Mike. I was just confused. Confused? He echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. You don't spend thousands of dollars on someone because you're confused. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she admitted, her voice breaking. I met Ryan at a networking event. He was helping me with marketing for the boutique. At first, it was just business, but I started confiding in him. I felt like he understood me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Mike stared at her, his chest tightening. And I didn't? Lauren wiped her tears, her hands trembling. It's not that, Mike. You've been so busy with work, and I've felt invisible. Like I don't matter anymore. Her words stung, but they didn't justify her actions. So instead of talking to me, you went to him, he asked, his voice laced with bitterness. I didn't plan it, she said softly. And I never meant to hurt you. nothing physical ever happened. I promise you that. Do you honestly think that makes it better? Mike's voice cracked. You've been lying to me for months, Lauren. You betrayed my trust. Do you have any idea what this feels like? Lauren sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I'm so sorry, Mike. I never wanted this to happen. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging heavy between them. Mike stood, unable to look at her. I need some air. Mike, please, she pleaded, but he was already walking toward the door. Outside, the cold night air hit Mike like a slap. He paced the driveway, his thoughts spiraling. Lauren's apology rang hollow in his ears. She hadn't physically cheated, but the emotional betrayal cut just as deep. How could they move forward from this? Could he even forgive her? He thought about Danny, their son who had unknowingly opened Pandora's box with a single innocent comment. Mike couldn't let this destroy their family, but the path to healing felt impossible to see. After a long moment, Mike turned and walked back inside. Lauren was still at the table, her tear-streaked face full of anguish. She looked up at him, hope flickering in her eyes. This isn't something we can fix overnight, Mike said, his voice weary. But for Danny's sake, we are going to have to figure it out. Lauren nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes. Mike wanted to believe her, but trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with words. It would take time, and right now, time was all he could offer. The days following Lauren's confession were tense and filled with an uncomfortable silence that hung over the house like a dark cloud. Mike moved through his routine on autopilot, avoiding prolonged conversations with Lauren and focusing his energy on Danny. Their son, blissfully unaware of the turmoil, was Mike's only anchor. Lauren, on the other hand, was visibly distraught. She made every effort to bridge the chasm between them, preparing Mike's favorite meals, tidying the house obsessively, and even leaving small notes on his nightstand that simply said, "I'm sorry" or "I'll do better." But none of it erased the gnawing ache in Mike's chest. One evening, after Danny had gone to bed, Lauren approached Mike as he sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She hesitated before sitting down beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Mike," she began softly, "I know I hurt you, and I know an apology isn't enough. But I need to know, is there any hope for us?" Mike didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the screen. "I don't know, Lauren. Right now, I can't even look at you without feeling betrayed." Her breath hitched, but she nodded, accepting his words. "I'll give you as much space as you need, but I want you to know that I'm not giving up on us." Mike finally turned to her, his expression a mixture of pain and exhaustion. "I'm not giving up either. But I can't just pretend this didn't happen." "I don't expect you to," she said quickly. "I'm willing to go to counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. I just want to make things right." Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Therapy might be a start. But, Lauren, this isn't just about fixing things for me. You need to figure out why you did this in the first place." She nodded again, tears brimming in her eyes. "I will. I promise." The following week, they scheduled their first session with a marriage counselor. The therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Harper, listened intently as Mike and Lauren recounted their perspectives. Lauren spoke about feeling neglected and unappreciated, while Mike expressed his hurt over her emotional betrayal. "It sounds like both of you have been living parallel lives," Dr. Harper observed gently. "Lauren, you felt invisible, and Mike, you were so focused on providing for your family that you missed the signs of her unhappiness." Mike clenched his jaw. "I was working to give her and Danny a good life. How is that wrong?" "It's not," Dr. Harper said. "But relationships require emotional presence as much as financial stability. Both of you have valid feelings, but moving forward means addressing the gaps that led to this situation." As the weeks went by, Therapy became a regular part of their routine. It wasn't easy. Sessions were often filled with raw emotions, tears, and uncomfortable truths. Lauren admitted that she had started seeking validation from Ryan because she felt unworthy of Mike's attention. Mike, in turn, acknowledged that he had taken Lauren's support for granted, assuming their relationship would thrive without much nurturing. Despite the progress they were making, Mike still struggled with trust. He couldn't help but question Lauren's every move. If her phone buzzed, his stomach twisted. If she was late coming home, his mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Lauren noticed his unease and went out of her way to be transparent. She gave Mike full access to her phone and email, and she stopped attending networking events unless he was comfortable with it. While her efforts were commendable, they couldn't erase the scars. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, a new activity suggested by their therapist, Danny wandered into the kitchen. "Mummy, Daddy, can we go to the park tomorrow?" he asked brightly. Mike froze, his hand tightening on the cutting board. Lauren's face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. We'll see, sweetheart," Lauren said after a pause. "Maybe another day." "Why not tomorrow?" Danny pressed. "You always say it's your favorite place to think." Mike looked at Lauren sharply, and she avoided his gaze. The park, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a battleground of painful memories. "Danny," Mike said gently, "how about we go somewhere new? Maybe the zoo?" Danny's face lit up. "Okay. Can we see the lions?" Mike smiled, ruffling his hair. "Of course." As Danny ran off, Lauren let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." "Don't," Mike said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We're trying to move forward. Let's leave the past where it belongs." Lauren nodded, though the tension in the room was palpable. That night, as Mike lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events. He wanted to forgive Lauren, not just for her sake but for his own. Holding on to anger and mistrust was exhausting, and he missed the simplicity of their earlier years together. But forgiveness wasn't something he could force. It had to come naturally, and he wasn't there yet. Lauren turned to him, her voice tentative in the darkness. "Mike." "Yeah. Do you still love me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Mike closed his eyes, searching for the answer within himself. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I want to. But I can't say it right now." Lauren's soft sobs broke the silence, and Mike's heart ached. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. Months passed, and while the pain of Lauren's betrayal hadn't vanished, the intensity of it began to fade. The therapy sessions were grueling but productive, peeling back layers of their relationship and forcing both Mike and Lauren to confront uncomfortable truths. Trust, however, remained the most challenging hurdle. Mike had agreed to try, not because he had forgiven Lauren entirely, but because he believed their marriage, and their family, deserved the effort. One weekend, while Mike was fixing the leaky faucet in the bathroom, Danny wandered in with his usual boyish curiosity. "Daddy, are you still mad at Mommy?" Danny asked innocently. Mike stopped mid-turn of the wrench. His son's question caught him off guard, even though it shouldn't have. Children noticed more than adults often gave them credit for. "I'm not mad," Mike said carefully, setting down the wrench and crouching to Danny's level. "Sometimes grown-ups just have problems they need to work through." Danny tilted his head. "Like when you helped me fix my robot?" Mike smiled faintly. "Kind of like that. But fixing grown-up problems takes a lot longer." Danny considered this for a moment. "So you and Mommy are still a team?" The words hit Mike like a bolt of clarity. Wasn't that the essence of marriage, a team? And while their team had faced its most significant challenge yet, they were still here, still trying. "Yeah, Buddy, Mike said, ruffling his hair. We are still a team. Later that evening, Mike shared the conversation with Lauren. They were sitting on the back porch, a place they'd begun using for quiet talks since therapy had encouraged them to carve out uninterrupted time for one another. Lauren's eyes welled with tears as Mike recounted Danny's words. He's such a sweet kid, she whispered. We don't deserve him. Maybe, Mike said. But we are lucky to have him. And we owe it to him to make this work. Lauren turned to him, her expression earnest. I know I have a lot to prove, Mike. And I know I hurt you. But I've learned so much through all of this, about myself, about us. I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that I can be better. Mike studied her face, looking for any sign of insincerity. He found none. Instead, he saw the woman he had fallen in love with years ago, the woman he had vowed to stand by, even when it was hard. I'm not saying it's all fixed, he said after a long pause. But I'm willing to keep trying. Lauren nodded, her tears spilling over as she reached for his hand. That's all I could ask for. The following weekend, they decided to go to the park as a family. It had been Lauren's suggestion, a gesture of reclaiming a place that had become tainted by secrecy. Mike hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. If they were going to heal, they couldn't avoid the places that held difficult memories, they had to redefine them. As they strolled along the familiar paths, Danny ran ahead, laughing as he chased the ducks near the pond. Lauren watched him, her expression soft but tinged with guilt. Do you think we'll ever get back to where we were? She asked quietly. Mike considered her question. I don't know if we can ever go back. But maybe we can move forward. Lauren nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She slipped her hand into his, a tentative gesture that Mike allowed. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step. Weeks turned into months, and the small, fragile steps began to add up. Mike found himself softening toward Lauren, though the road was far from smooth. Trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight, but Lauren's consistent efforts helped. She was transparent about her actions, her schedule, and her emotions, determined to prove that she was fully committed to their marriage. Mike, in turn, worked on being more present. He spent more time with Lauren and Danny, setting aside work emails and late nights to focus on what truly mattered. They still attended therapy, both individually and as a couple, and while the process was often uncomfortable, it forced them to confront their vulnerabilities and rebuild the foundation they had lost. One evening, as they sat together watching Danny perform an impromptu magic show, Mike glanced at Lauren. She was laughing, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a way he hadn't seen in months. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mike didn't feel the weight of betrayal pressing on his chest. Instead, he felt hope. Thank you, Lauren whispered later that night as they prepared for bed. For giving me another chance. Mike met her gaze, his expression serious but kind. You're earning it. And I'm learning to let go. She nodded, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. We'll get there. Together. As they lay in bed, Lauren's hand found his. Mike didn't pull away. He wasn't ready to say he had completely forgiven her, but he realized he was finally ready to take the next step forward, because, in the end, their team was worth fighting for.